I sold a Pokémon collection I had kept for almost 20 years so I could buy a house in cash. 3 months later, the president of the Homeowners Association stood on my porch, holding an envelope and a cold little smile. Inside was a bill for $11,000, a warning about a lien, and a line telling me my home could be sold if I refused to pay. Vanessa Whitcomb told me I did not understand how this neighborhood worked. She was right about one thing. I did not understand it yet. But she had no idea my house was hiding a document that could tear her association apart. If you enjoy stories where an association thinks it has already won and quietly digs its own grave, subscribe and watch me flip the board. I should start 3 months earlier, back when the biggest thing in my life fit inside 4 plastic storage bins stacked in the corner of a rented 1-bedroom apartment. I had been collecting since I was 11 years old, back when a pack cost pocket change and the cardboard smelled like sugar and glue. Most people my age threw their cards away or lost them in a flooded basement, but I never did, mostly because I never had much else worth keeping. My name is Nolan Pierce. I was 43 that spring, and I made my living doing freelance technical work that paid well in good months and paid nothing at all in bad ones. The bins moved with me through 6 apartments, 2 layoffs, 1 broken engagement, and a stretch of about 14 months where I ate a lot of rice and pretended I liked it. I never sold a single card during any of that, even when selling would have been the smart thing to do. Those bins were the only proof I had that I used to be somebody who believed good things could last. By the time I turned 40, the market had turned into something none of us who started in the 90s ever expected. Cards I had bought for the price of a school lunch were selling for more than my old car. I had a few graded pieces from the earliest print runs, the kind that come back from the grading company, sealed in a hard plastic slab with a serial number laser etched into the label. I had a shadowless holo that I pulled myself at a friend's kitchen table in 1999, and I remembered the exact sound the pack made when it tore. Every year the number went up, and every year I told myself I would hold a little longer, because holding was the only thing I had ever been good at. Then one October the roof of my rental leaked directly over the closet where the bins sat, and I spent an entire night on the floor with a flashlight and a towel, checking every slab for moisture. That was the night I understood I was not protecting the collection anymore. The collection was protecting me from having to make a decision. Selling took 8 months, and it was more paperwork than most people would believe. Serious collectors do not just hand over a box and take a check, because the market runs on documentation and nothing else. Every valuable card has a grading record, a certification number, a population report, and a chain of previous sales that anyone can pull up and verify in about 90 seconds. I photographed every slab from 4 angles, matched each certification number against the grader's public database, and kept a spreadsheet with the date, the buyer, the platform fee, and the final number. 2 of the biggest pieces went through an auction house that required a signed consignment agreement and a notarized identity check before they would even accept the package. By the time the last lot cleared, I had learned something that would matter more than I could have guessed. In a market full of fakes and stories, the story is worth nothing, and the paperwork is worth everything. When the final wire hit, I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and looked at the balance for a long time without feeling anything at all. It was more money than I had ever seen at once, and less than people assume when they hear a headline about a card selling for a fortune. After fees and taxes, it was enough to buy a modest house, outright in a decent suburb, with a little left over for repairs and a cushion. That was the entire point. I had spent my whole adult life 1 bad quarter away from disaster, and I wanted one thing in the world that no bank could take from me if I had a slow year. Not a mansion, not a status address, just 4 walls with my name on the deed and no monthly payment attached. I looked at 17 houses before I found the one. 18 Alder Ridge sat at the far eastern edge of a neighborhood called Cedar Hollow, on a slightly odd lot that was deeper than the ones around it and set back farther from the road. It was a low brick ranch built long before the rest of the street, with a wide front porch, an oak in the yard older than anyone living on the block, and a detached garage that leaned about 2 degrees off true. The inspector found the usual things: a water heater near the end of its life, and a section of fence that needed replacing, and nothing that scared him. The listing agent mentioned that the previous owner had lived there almost 30 years and had moved out of state to be closer to her daughter. Her name was Evelyn Shaw, and at the time she was nothing more than a signature on a form to me. I paid cash. I closed in 19 days, and I remember thinking the whole process felt strangely quiet for something that large. At closing, they handed me a folder about 2 inches thick, and I did what almost every buyer does, which is nod politely and stop reading around page 4. There was a deed, a title report, a survey with the lot outlined in blue, a title insurance policy, a tax certificate, and a pile of disclosures with initials scattered across the bottom corners. The closing agent slid each page across, pointed at the line, and moved on before I could finish a sentence. I signed my name so many times that by the end, it stopped looking like a word. Then I put the entire folder in a fireproof box in the hall closet and forgot about it, because the title company had reviewed everything, and that was what I was paying them for. It is strange to think about now. I had verified a piece of cardboard down to its serial number, and I had accepted the largest purchase of my life on trust. I moved in on a Saturday in April with a rented truck and 2 friends who gave up around noon. Around 4 in the afternoon, while I was wrestling a mattress through the front door, a silver sedan pulled up to the curb, and a woman got out holding a folder of her own. She was in her early 50s, dressed like she had come from somewhere more important, and she introduced herself as Vanessa Whitcomb, president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association. She welcomed me to the community in a voice, with a smile stitched onto the front of it, and asked what I did for work. I told her freelance technical consulting, and she waited, the way people do when they expect a number to follow. Then one of my friends, trying to be funny, said I had bought the place with a pile of trading cards. I explained it in about 2 sentences, because I have learned that the full version makes people uncomfortable. Vanessa listened with her head tilted slightly, and something behind her eyes rearranged itself. Then she laughed, a short, polite sound, and said she was glad the cartoon pictures had finally helped me do something adult with my life. My friend laughed because he thought it was a joke, and I laughed too, because that is the reflex. She handed me a welcome sheet with the trash schedule and the exterior paint palette on it, told me the association took great pride in Cedar Hollow's standards, and got back in her car. I stood in the driveway holding the sheet and feeling a very specific kind of small. I filed it away as one rude remark from one uptight woman and went back to moving my mattress. Looking back, I understand exactly what happened in that driveway, and it had nothing to do with cards. Vanessa had spent 30 seconds trying to place me in the hierarchy of her street and had come up with an answer she did not like. A single man in his 40s, no wife, no visible career, no mortgage, living in the oldest and oddest house on the block, who had funded the whole thing with something she considered childish. I was not a neighbor to her. I was a category error, an unexplained variable in a spreadsheet she believed she owned. People like Vanessa do not tolerate unexplained variables, they resolve them. It took her about 11 days to start. The first notice came taped to my front door in a clear plastic sleeve, printed on association letterhead, describing a violation of the sanitation storage provision. My trash bin had remained visible from the street for approximately 9 hours past the collection window. There was no fine attached, just a warning and a reference to a section number of a document I had never seen. I read it twice, felt vaguely embarrassed, and moved the bin into the garage. The second notice arrived 4 days later and concerned a vehicle parked in my own driveway, which apparently constituted extended visible storage under some provision I also had not read. The vehicle in question belonged to a plumber who was in my crawl space at the time, replacing a section of pipe that had been leaking since before I owned the house. A third notice arrived 2 weeks later about the color temperature of the bulb above my garage door, which was described as inconsistent with community standards. I did not know that community standards had opinions about light bulbs. I bought a warmer bulb and installed it that evening, while my neighbor across the street watched from his porch without saying anything. The fourth notice concerned grass near the mailbox exceeding the permitted height, which was true by roughly an inch in a strip about 2 feet wide. I fixed everything every single time within days because I did not want a war with anybody. What made it strange was not the notices themselves. It was that Vanessa kept showing up in person. She had a management company that mailed letters, and yet, twice a week her silver sedan would slow in front of my house, and sometimes she would get out and walk halfway up my driveway to point at something. She never raised her voice. She spoke in the tone of a patient teacher, explaining a rule to a child who has already broken it twice, and she always ended with some version of the same sentence. Cedar Hollow, she told me, is not a place where people simply live however they please. I remember standing there in a paint-stained shirt while she explained my own yard to me, and feeling the beginning of something I had not felt in years. Around the 6th week, I started asking questions instead of just complying. I asked her, politely, to send me a copy of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, because every notice cited section numbers I had no way to check. She said the management company handled document requests. I emailed the management company, and they sent a portal link that did not work, then a second link that led to a login I did not have credentials for. I asked Vanessa again in person, and she told me the documents were recorded publicly, and that a homeowner in good standing generally did not need to interrogate them. Then I asked the question that I think actually started everything, because of the way her face changed when I said it. I asked when exactly I had joined the association, since I did not recall signing anything about membership at closing. She looked at me for a moment the way you look at a dog that has done a trick it should not know. Then she said, in a voice like a door closing, that I had bought a house here, and therefore I belonged to the association, and that it was really that simple. I said I understood, and I did not push, because at that point I was thinking about the money, and the money was small. Cedar Hollow's annual dues, according to the welcome sheet, ran a few $100s a year. That was less than I had once spent on a single card, and fighting about it would cost more in time than paying it ever would, so I let it go. I told myself I was being the reasonable adult in the situation, and I went back to sanding the porch railing and pretending my stomach did not hurt every time a silver sedan slowed down outside. Then, on a Monday morning in early July, I opened my front door and found a red envelope. It was heavy, which is the first thing I noticed, because bad news is usually thin. Inside was a statement running 11 pages, printed on the association's letterhead, with my address and parcel number across the top of every sheet. The number at the bottom of the last column was $11,043.72. I read it, standing in the doorway with the door still open and the morning heat coming in around my legs. I remember thinking there had been an error. A decimal slipped. A file merged with somebody else's account. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never drank and went through it, line by line. It was not an error, it was a construction. The largest single item was a special assessment of a little over $7,000, described as each owner's proportional portion of a capital project covering private roadway resurfacing and common area landscape restoration. Beneath that sat a category of allegedly unpaid regular dues, calculated not from my closing date but from a date more than 2 years before I had ever heard of Cedar Hollow. Under that came violation penalties, each one tied to a notice I had already cured, each carrying a fine I had never been told about, several of them compounding monthly. Then there were administrative charges for processing those violations, collection expenses for pursuing the balance those charges created, and an attorney processing fee for preparing the very document I was holding. It was a machine. Every part of it existed to justify the next part, and the whole thing had been running for weeks before anyone told me it had been turned on. The final page was the one that made my hands cold. That page explained that if the balance was not paid in full within 30 days, the association could record a claim of lien against the property, refer the account to counsel, and pursue all available remedies for collection, including foreclosure where permitted by law. I read the word foreclosure 4 times, I had bought this house specifically so that no institution on earth could ever put that word in a letter addressed to me. I had sold the only thing I had carried out of my childhood to make that true. And here was a woman with a folder and a laminated welcome sheet, telling me she could take it anyway, over a road I had never asked anyone to repave. I sat in that kitchen for about an hour without moving. Then I drove to the association office. The office was 2 rooms in a small building near the entrance to the subdivision with a laminated sign and a bowl of hard candy on the counter. Vanessa sat behind a desk with a laptop and a cup of tea, and she looked pleased to see me, which was worse than if she had looked hostile. I put the statement down and asked her to walk me through it, and she did calmly, in the tone of someone explaining a menu. When I asked how I could owe dues for a period before I owned the house, she said assessments run with the land. When I asked why I had never received notice of a special assessment vote, she said notice had gone to the address of record. When I asked which address, she smiled and said she was not going to relitigate the association's procedures with me. So I asked her the only question that mattered, and I asked it plainly. I asked her to show me the document that made my property subject to the association's authority. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and told me she found it interesting that I was suddenly so concerned about a few $1,000s. Then she said the sentence I have repeated in my head more times than any other from that entire year. She said that I had just sold a pile of Pokémon cards to buy a house in cash, so I should not pretend I did not have $11,000 sitting somewhere. The room got very quiet, and in that quiet I finally understood that this was never about roadway resurfacing, or trash bins, or the color of a light bulb. She had priced me. She had looked at a man who paid cash and had no employer and no family in the area and no obvious allies on the street, and she had calculated exactly how much friction I could absorb before writing a check to make the discomfort stop. The number was not random. The number was what she thought I would pay to be left alone. I told her I would not pay anything until the association provided the full legal basis for every charge on the statement, in writing, with the recorded documents attached. Her smile finally went away, and what was underneath it was not angry at all. Just flat and patient, she said, "Then you can try to keep your house." I walked out into the parking lot and stood by my car with my keys in my hand, breathing like I had run somewhere. Here is where I have to explain something about collectors, because it is the only reason this story has an ending I like. When you spend 2 decades buying and selling objects whose value comes entirely from authenticity, you develop a specific kind of paranoia that never fully leaves you. A card that looks perfect can be a reprint with a trimmed edge. A slab that looks sealed can be a resealed shell with a swapped insert. A seller with a beautiful story about a garage find and a grandmother's attic can be a man with a color printer and a good scanner. So the rule we all learn, usually after losing money, is short and absolute. You do not buy the story, you verify the provenance. Provenance means the documented history of an object from origin to present, with no gaps. For a valuable card, that means the certification number, the population report, the grading company's public lookup, the auction records, the photographs from previous listings, the invoice chain. If any link is missing, the item is not worth what the seller says it is worth, no matter how confident he sounds or how nice the photos look. I had once walked away from a purchase I badly wanted because a certification number returned a slightly different grade in the database than the one printed on the label. The seller had a very reasonable explanation. The explanation was a lie, and 3 months later, he was banned from every major marketplace. I drove home from the association office that afternoon and realized I had just spent an hour arguing with someone about a story while sitting on a folder of unread documents. I opened the fireproof box that night and put everything on the dining room table under the good lamp. The deed, the title commitment and the final policy, the tax certificate, the disclosures, and at the bottom, folded into thirds, the survey and a copy of the recorded subdivision plat for Cedar Hollow. I started the way I would start with a card, which is to say I ignored every claim anyone had made to me and looked only at what the documents actually said. It took about 40 minutes before my hands started shaking, and it was not because of anything dramatic. It was because of a list. Attached to the association's original declaration, recorded decades earlier by the original developer, was an exhibit describing exactly which parcels the declaration governed. It was a plain-typed list of lot numbers and legal descriptions, 3 columns wide, running about a page and a half. It was tedious in the way that important documents almost always are, which is probably why nobody had read it in 20 years. I went down the list with a pen, checking each entry against my own legal description from the deed. My lot was not on it. I checked again, slower, then a third time out loud, and my lot was still not on it. I told myself I was misreading a legal description because they are dense and full of bearings and distances, and it is easy to get lost. So, the next morning I drove to the county recorder's office and pulled everything they had on the property and the subdivision, which turned out to be considerably more than the closing folder contained. There was the original declaration with all its exhibits, 4 recorded amendments spread across 2 decades, 3 separate plat maps showing the subdivision at different stages of development, and the older instruments describing the land before Cedar Hollow existed at all. I paid for copies of every page and spread them across my dining table that evening in chronological order, and the picture that assembled itself was not complicated. Once I stopped assuming the neighborhood had always looked the way it does now. My house was older than the subdivision around it. 18 Alder Ridge had been built on a parcel that predated Cedar Hollow by many years, back when the whole eastern side of the area was a single large agricultural tract with 1 farmhouse and a long gravel drive. When the developer bought the tract to build the subdivision, the parcel containing that house was already separately owned and was not part of the purchase. The developer built around it, subdividing the surrounding acreage into the lots that became Alder Ridge and the streets behind it, which is why my lot is deeper and set back differently from every other house on the block. The odd shape of my yard was not a quirk of design. It was the fossil of a boundary that existed before the neighborhood did. And, in the original declaration, in the exhibit describing the land the developer was placing under association control, my parcel appeared exactly once. It appeared under 3 words that I have not stopped thinking about since. Excluded Parcel A. The legal description that followed matched my deed line for line, bearing for bearing, down to the final distance. There was no ambiguity, no clever interpretation required, no reading between anything. The developer had drawn a boundary around the association's authority and had deliberately left my house outside of it. Then, 20-some years of turnover happened, and boards changed, and management companies changed, and at some point, everyone simply started assuming that the brick ranch on the corner was part of the neighborhood because it looked like it should be. I sat back in my chair at 2 in the morning with a highlighter in my hand and said it out loud to an empty room. My house may never have been part of this association at all. The next morning, I wrote the association a short, careful email because I had learned from a decade of selling to strangers that the strongest position is always the most boring one. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I did not mention excluded Parcel A. I simply requested in writing the specific recorded instrument that subjected my parcel to the declaration, along with the recorded evidence of the special assessment vote and an itemized accounting of every fine. I said I would pay any amount the association could demonstrate a legal basis to collect, and that I would pay it promptly. Then I saved a copy, printed it, and started a folder, because in a dispute the person with the better records wins more often than the person with the better argument. I expected silence, or a form letter, or another notice about my grass. What I got 2 days later nearly ended the whole thing. Vanessa replied personally, which she almost never did, and attached a scanned document 3 pages long. It was titled Joinder and Annexation Agreement, and it stated that the owner of the described parcel, voluntarily and for good and valuable consideration, submitted the property to the Cedar Hollow Declaration and accepted all obligations of membership. The legal description matched my lot. The date was several years before I bought the house. At the bottom of the 3rd page, above a notary block with a stamp and a commission number, was a signature. Evelyn Shaw. I read the document about 9 times and felt the floor tilt. If that agreement was valid, everything I had found in the county records became irrelevant in a single stroke. It would not matter that the developer excluded the parcel because a later owner would have voluntarily brought it in and the obligation would run with the land straight to me. Vanessa's next email arrived 11 minutes after the first, and it was one line. She wrote that she hoped this time I would read before deciding I was smarter than the entire board. I sat at the table with the scan open on my laptop and did the math on my life. $11,000 was survivable. A lawsuit against an association with a legal budget, and my own savings on the line was a different category of risk. I had the checkbook out. I actually had it out on the table. What stopped me was not courage. It was a habit that had been drilled into me by 20 years of examining objects under a desk lamp. Before I write a check for anything, I look at the least interesting part of the item, because forgers spend their effort on the parts people look at first. On a card, that means the back, the edges, and the tiny print near the copyright line, not the artwork. On a document I discovered, it means the notary block. So I zoomed in on that stamp and read every element of it, the name, the commission number, the expiration date, and the county of commission, and then I compared them to the date typed into the acknowledgement line above. Something was wrong with the dates, and it was wrong in a way that took me another hour to articulate clearly. The acknowledgement stated the document was signed and sworn before the notary on a specific day in the spring of a particular year. But the recording stamp in the corner, the one applied by the county when an instrument is entered into the public record, showed a date more than a year and a half later. That gap alone is not proof of anything, since people do sit on documents. What bothered me more was that the notary's commission expiration date, printed in the stamp, did not sit comfortably with the acknowledgement date. It sat almost exactly a full commission cycle off, the way a date does when someone works backward from a stamp they already have, rather than forward from an event that actually happened. I stared at that block until my eyes hurt and I could not make it resolve. So I did the thing I should have done first, which is what I would do with any card of uncertain history. I went and found the previous owner. Evelyn Shaw was not hard to locate once I stopped looking online and started calling people. The listing agent gave me the name of the closing attorney, who gave me nothing, but who mentioned that Evelyn's daughter had handled most of the arrangements. 2 phone calls later, I had a number in a different state, and a woman answered on the 4th ring with a voice like someone who was expecting a scam. I told her exactly who I was, that I lived in her mother's old house, and that I needed 40 minutes and no money from anyone. She put me on hold for what felt like a very long time. Then a second voice came on, older, dry, unhurried, and said she had wondered how long it would take before somebody from Cedar Hollow called her. That sentence did something to the back of my neck. Evelyn Shaw was 67 and had lived at 18 Alder Ridge for 29 years. She told me about the oak and about the year the detached garage started leaning. Then I asked about the association, and her tone changed the way a road changes when the pavement ends. She said they had asked her to join 4 separate times, and she had declined every time because her water, her driveway, and her road frontage had never had anything to do with them. A board member once told her she was making the street look inconsistent. She said she told him the street had grown up around her, not the other way around, and he could take it up with the man who drew the map. I sent the scan and stayed on the phone while she opened it, and I listened to her breathing and the sound of a screen door somewhere behind her. She was quiet for close to a full minute, which is an extremely long time on a telephone. Then she asked me to describe the signature, and I did, letter by letter, the loop on the E, the way the W in Shaw ran flat at the bottom. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Then she said the sentence that turned the entire dispute inside out. She said she had never signed that document in her life, and that on the date printed on it, she had been sitting in a hospital 200 miles away with her sister. I did not sleep that night. I also did not do the thing I wanted to do, which was drive to Vanessa's house at 6 in the morning with a printout and an accusation. Because here is the other lesson collecting teaches you, and it is the harder one. Being certain is not the same as being able to prove it, and the moment you make a claim you cannot document, you hand the other side a weapon. If I called that agreement a forgery in an email and was wrong about one detail, I would spend the rest of the fight defending my own words instead of examining theirs. So I did nothing loud. I found a real estate attorney named Miles Harlan, 46 years old, who had spent most of his career on title disputes and boundary work, and I put every document I had on his conference table in chronological order with an index on top. He looked at the index for a while before he looked at anything else, and then he said something I appreciated more than any reassurance. He said most clients bring him a story, and I had brought him a file. Miles refused to say the word forgery, and he refused to let me say it either. He explained that a signature dispute is slow, expensive, and easy for the other side to muddy, and that we did not need it if the foundation was already rotten. Instead, he worked outward from the least arguable facts, the way you would authenticate anything valuable. He pulled the complete chain of title on my parcel going back 60 years, every deed, every conveyance, every instrument recorded against the property. He pulled the association's declaration and all 4 amendments and read them for the annexation provisions, which specify the exact procedure required to add land. Then he pulled the plat maps, the notary's commission records, and Evelyn's own closing file through her daughter. It took 11 days, and every single day the picture got worse for the association. The chain of title was clean and it was decisive. Between the original recording of the declaration and the day I took ownership, exactly 4 instruments had been recorded against my parcel, and Miles read them to me one at a time. A deed transferring the property to Evelyn and her late husband, a mortgage, a satisfaction of that mortgage, and the deed conveying the property to me. That was all. There was no annexation instrument, no supplemental declaration, no amendment adding the parcel, and no joinder agreement anywhere in the recorded chain during the period when the association claimed one had been executed. The document Vanessa had emailed me did eventually appear in the county's index, but its recording stamp placed it in a window that made no sense, and it was not attached to any corresponding board action, amendment, or vote. Miles found something else that mattered even more, and he found it in the declaration itself. The annexation provision required that any addition of land be accomplished by a supplemental declaration executed by the association, approved by a stated percentage of the membership, and recorded in the county records. A signature from a property owner alone, even a genuine one, could not have accomplished what the association claimed. There was no supplemental declaration. There was no recorded vote. There was no board resolution referencing my parcel in any minutes from that entire year. Even in the most generous reading, where the signature was real and Evelyn's memory was faulty, the association had still never taken the steps its own governing documents required. The house had never been legally brought in. Then Evelyn's daughter sent us the box. Evelyn had kept every piece of paper her house had ever generated in 3 accordion files in a closet, which is a thing more people should do. Inside were letters from the association going back years, and among them were 2 that Miles read twice and then set aside carefully. One was a letter from a previous board, dated more than a decade earlier, formally acknowledging her decision to decline participation. The other was an email chain printed on paper in which a board member confirmed to a management company that her parcel remained non-member property and should not be included in the assessment roll. Those were not my documents or my interpretation. They were the association's own words, written by the association's own officers about my house. Miles put them in a binder and said quietly that we now had a case that did not require anyone to prove a forgery. We sent all of it. Miles drafted a letter that ran 9 pages with 41 pages of exhibits, laying out the exclusion in the original declaration, the absence of any annexation instrument, the failure to follow the association's own procedure, the prior board's written acknowledgement, and Evelyn's sworn statement that she had never executed the agreement. He requested that the association withdraw the assessment, cease all collection activity, preserve all records including internal communications, and confirm in writing that it claimed no authority over the parcel. It was firm and it was not insulting, which Miles said was deliberate. He told me the goal was to give the association a dignified exit, because organizations that are humiliated early fight longer and cost more. I thought that was very reasonable and very wise. Vanessa recorded the lien 9 days later. I found out from the county's online index at 11 at night, sitting in the dark with my laptop on my knees. A claim of lien in the amount of $11,043.72, plus continuing charges, recorded against 18 Alder Ridge. It sat there in the public record attached to my address, visible to any bank, any title company, any future buyer, any human being who typed my street into a search field. I want to be honest about what that night was like, because the parts of these stories that get skipped are usually the true ones. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher, and I could not get a full breath in for about 20 minutes. I had sold the only thing I owned from my childhood so that no one could ever attach a word like that to my home. And a woman who had never once asked me a real question about my life had done it anyway, in writing, in public, because I would not hand her money she could not prove I owed. I ran into her 4 days later, outside the market, at the entrance to the subdivision, and I think she had been waiting, though I will never know. She was putting bags in the trunk of the silver sedan, and she saw me and did not look away. She said she was sorry it had come to this, in a tone with no sorry anywhere inside it. Then she said I should have paid it back when it was only $11,000. I did not answer her. I stood there holding a bag of groceries and understanding, finally and completely, that she had never been trying to enforce a rule. She had been trying to establish that she could make me obey one. What Vanessa did not know, standing in that parking lot, was that Miles had received one more document the day before. He had requested the developer's original working survey from an engineering firm that had absorbed the company that platted Cedar Hollow, and a records clerk there had actually gone into storage and found it. It was a large sheet, hand-drafted, with the subdivision boundary inked in heavy line and the interior lots numbered in a careful draftsman's hand. In the eastern corner, my parcel was outlined separately, hatched, and set apart from everything around it. Written beside it in block capitals, in the same hand as the rest of the sheet, were the words excluded, not subject to association declaration. Miles laid it flat on his table, looked at it for a while, and said that in 22 years he had rarely seen a document answer a question that cleanly. The meeting happened in a conference room on the 4th floor of an office building downtown on a Thursday morning in September. Vanessa came with the association's attorney, a tired-looking man in his 60s named Rowan who, I suspect, had been given a very confident summary of the facts. Vanessa wore something expensive and sat very straight and greeted me by name with a small nod, as though we were colleagues who had disagreed about a budget. I could see the strategy in the room before anyone spoke, and it was the oldest one there is. They believed I would fold, not because I was wrong, but because litigation is expensive, and I was one man with a savings account and no institution behind me. Miles let them open. Rowan spoke for about 6 minutes about the association's authority, the presumption of validity attaching to recorded instruments, and the practical costs of protracted disputes. Then Miles did something I did not expect, which was to say almost nothing at all. He opened a folder and laid 4 things on the table facing them. The original declaration open to the exhibit, with excluded parcel highlighted and my legal description beside it. The developer's hand-drafted survey with the hatched corner and the block capitals. The prior board's letter to Evelyn acknowledging she had declined. The printed email confirming her parcel was non-member property. He squared the edges, sat back, and asked one question. He asked them to show him the specific recorded instrument that placed parcel 18 under the association's declaration. Nobody answered. Rowan reached for the survey and turned it toward himself and read it for what felt like a very long time. Then he asked Vanessa, without looking up, whether the board had reviewed the exhibit to the original declaration before authorizing the assessment. She said the management company maintained the assessment role. He asked again, more slowly, whether the board had reviewed the exhibit. She said the role had been in continuous use for many years, and that she had relied on it in good faith. Rowan requested a recess. The recess lasted 50 minutes, and when they came back, the room had changed shape entirely. Rowan said the association would be withdrawing the demand pending a records review and asked Miles for copies of everything he had presented. Miles said he would provide them, and then said, mildly, that he had also requested the association's internal communications regarding my property and expected them preserved. Vanessa said something about privilege. Rowan said, in a voice that ended the discussion, that they would address it appropriately. That was the moment I watched a woman lose control of her own story in real time. She had been the one who decided what was true in Cedar Hollow for 11 years, and it took less than an hour and 4 pieces of paper. What finished it was not my lawyer, and it was not me. It was a board member named Dana Cruel, 39, who had joined the board 2 years earlier and had been quietly uncomfortable for a while about how many enforcement decisions were being made by one person between meetings. When Rowan's office asked the board for records, Dana pulled the management company's correspondence herself, instead of routing the request through the president. In that correspondence was a message from an account manager, sent 8 days before my red envelope, and it was 2 sentences long. It said the ownership and membership status of 18 Alder Ridge should be verified against the declaration exhibits before any assessment was issued, because the parcel history appeared irregular. 14 minutes later, Vanessa had replied. Her reply was 3 words, bill him anyway. Dana read it again, and forwarded the entire chain to every member of the board and to Rowan's office with no added words at all, which I have always thought was the most devastating possible way to send it. An emergency meeting was called for the following week. Vanessa tried, by every account I heard afterward, to make the whole thing a clerical failure by the management company, an inherited error, a role that predated her. But the timeline did not cooperate. She had been warned in writing. She had been told the parcel history looked irregular, and she had chosen to bill me anyway, and then she had escalated to a recorded lien after receiving a 9-page letter with 41 exhibits explaining why she could not. There is no version of good faith that survives 3 words like that. The association released the lien 22 days later. The full $11,043.72 was canceled in its entirety, along with every fine, every administrative charge, and every collection expense. In the settlement that ended the matter, the association acknowledged in writing that my parcel is not subject to its declaration, agreed to remove it permanently from the assessment roll, and paid the substantial majority of my reasonable legal costs, in exchange for both sides closing the dispute. The board opened an internal review of every parcel in Cedar Hollow with a pre-development history, and I am told they found 2 others with questions attached, though nothing like mine. Dana Crowell became president in the spring. Vanessa Whitcomb resigned before the removal vote could be held, which I suspect was the last strategic decision she had left. Her house went on the market 14 months later, and I did not watch the listing. People ask me whether I joined the association afterward, out of goodwill, now that reasonable people were running it. I did not, and the reason is not spite. My parcel was drawn outside that boundary by a man with a drafting pen decades before I existed in this neighborhood, and I have decided that the map should mean what it says. Dana asked once, kindly, and I told her that if the association ever needed something from my corner of the street, she could knock on my door like a neighbor, and I would probably say yes. She laughed and said that was fair. So the oldest house on Alder Ridge stays exactly what it has always been, which is an independent parcel with a leaning garage and an oak tree older than the pavement. That, it turns out, is what I actually bought. I never rebuilt the collection. I thought about it for a while, in the strange, flat weeks after the settlement, when the adrenaline drained out and left nothing behind it. But the truth is that the bins had already done the only job they were ever going to do, and buying them back would have been a way of pretending the last 20 years had not happened. So I bought one card instead. It was a common one, unremarkable, worth about $6, the same one I pulled from my first pack at 11 years old at a friend's kitchen table with the packaging still in my hand. I put it in a small black frame and hung it in the hallway next to the framed copy of my deed, and a photocopy of the developer's survey with the hatched corner. 3 pieces of paper, all of them ordinary, all of them mine. Sometimes I sit on that wide front porch in the evening and think about how close it came and what actually saved me. It was not intelligence, and it was not money, and it was certainly not courage, because I was frightened for most of it. It was a habit, learned young over a hobby that a woman in a silver sedan thought was childish. That taught me a valuable thing is only worth what its documentation can prove. Vanessa spent 11 years running a neighborhood on the authority of a story that nobody had ever checked, and she came at a man whose entire life had trained him to check. I sold every card I owned to buy this house. She thought $11,000 could take it out of my hands. In the end, the thing she lost was not my money, it was every bit of power she had.